Hi guys! Today our lesson is so interesting and interactive too. Before we start our lesson for today, please make sure that you're having with you your science notebook, your pen, pencil, eraser, ruler, colored pens, and the necessary stationery that you may use during the science session. Regarding the science textbook, I know that most of you they didn't receive the science book yet, but once it's available in the bookstore, you will receive it. So don't worry about it. During our lesson today, we're going to discuss two simple objectives, and we will learn about the importance of a given experiment for a scientist and what are the different variables in a given experiment and how can we identify them. Also, we are going to remind you about how to choose the best inquiry question, but today we will link choosing the right inquiry question to what you're going to learn through this session. The given objectives are related to the science skills objectives. So by the end of the session, you should be able to state the three types of variables and their definitions, and you have to identify these three types of variables within a given experiment. While scientists are observing the world around them, they will start identifying focused questions. And after identifying these questions, they will start figuring out how to find their answers. Usually, scientists use many ways to find answers to their questions, but one of the most important ways is by carrying out a given experiment. So usually scientists use experiments to find out answers for their questions. Or we can say that scientists use the experiment to start finding out answers to their questions. Well then, what is an experiment? We can think of an experiment as the scientific process or the scientific procedure where we can control certain things and find out what effect is caused by changing them. So in a given experiment, we have many kinds of variables. First, let's define what we mean by the word variable. A variable is anything that can be changed in an experiment. Okay? Now, let's go for the kinds of variables. The variable that you are changing in a given experiment, or the variable that is the scientist changing in a given experiment, we call it an independent variable. Why did we call it as independent variable? Because it doesn't or shouldn't depend on anything else. We are changing that variable in a given experiment. However, the variable that we are measuring in a given experiment, or the variable to measure in a given experiment, is called dependent variable, because we think it will depend on the independent variable. So the variable that is the scientist changing is the independent variable. The variable that we are measuring is the dependent variable. The third variable that we have to know is what do we call the control variable. Usually the control variable, if we change it in a given experiment, it will affect the dependent variable, but we don't want to test for. So, a control variable in a scientific experimentation is an experimental element which is constant and unchanged through the whole course of the investigation. So, by controlling these variables, we make sure that our experiment is showing us the effect we want to find. So, by controlling these variables, as we are going to name them the controlled variables, we are making sure that our experiment is a valid experiment. So believe me, you will find it very easy to identify the dependent variable and the independent variable when we start with the examples. Let's start with the first example then. In this example, actually, Rami would like to test the effect of different amount of fertilizers on the rate of plant growth. So here in the given pots that are shown in this photo, as you move to the right, the amount of fertilizer is increasing, and the first one, which is the control pot, it doesn't have fertilizers at all. Now, we identified before two types of variables, the dependent one and the independent one. We explained that the independent one is the variable that the scientist is changing, while the dependent one is the variable that the scientist is measuring. Okay? So, what is Rami changing every time? Because Rami in this case is the scientist, Rami every time is changing the amount of fertilizer. So because Rami is every time changing the amount of fertilizer, then the amount of fertilizer will be considered what? The independent variable. And what is Rami measuring is the change in the rate of plant growth. So Rami is measuring, or Rami is monitoring the change in the rate of plant growth, okay, as long as he is changing the amount of fertilizer. So the rate of plant growth is depending on the change in the amount of fertilizers. So what Rami is testing is what do we call the dependent variable, and what Rami is changing is the independent variable. Hence, in short, what the scientist is changing, or the factor that the scientist is changing, is the independent variable, and the factor that is the scientist testing or measuring is the dependent variable. We can explain it in another way too. What should Rami do? Rami has to change the amount of fertilizer, then measure the height of the plant accordingly, or he has to measure the height of the plant, then change the amount of fertilizer. For sure, what he has to do is that he should measure the amount of fertilizer, then measure the height of the plant accordingly. So Rami is changing the amount of the fertilizer, and every time he is measuring the height of the plant. So the independent variable that does not depend on anything else in the experiment and that Rami is changing is the amount of fertilizer. And the dependent variable that depends on the independent variable that Rami will measure is the height of the plant. So let's summarize it. The independent variable causes the effect on the dependent variable. So again, the dependent variable is the result measured according to the independent variable. If you didn't get it yet, don't panic, because we're going to show you different examples to help you master identifying the experimental variables. Don't worry about that. Now, let's go for this example, or let's look at the picture on this slide. On this slide, you are shown two plants. One is kept under the sunlight, while the other one is kept inside a box. Do you think the same amount of fertilizers will similarly affect both plants? Even if you're going to change the amount of fertilizers, can you detect the growth of both plants where one is kept under the sunlight while the other one is kept inside the box? Can we compare the growth of the plant, of both plants, if they were given different amount of fertilizers while one is kept under the sunlight and the other one is kept in a box? Can we do such comparison? So you have to remember that there are different factors that affect the growth of the plant other than the amount of the fertilizers added. So the sunlight is another variable that also affects the growth of the plant. Hence, if Rami wants to measure the effect of the amount of the fertilizers on the growth of the plants, he must place both plants in the same place or under the sunlight. So the sunlight should be a variable that is not changing through the whole experiment, which means that all the plants again should receive the same amount of the sunlight. So the sunlight should be a controlled variable. And controlled variables are very important to make our experiment valid ones. And you have to remember that a valid experiment, or in a valid experiment, the collected results are reliable. So we have to think of other variables that also affect the growth of plants and thus must be controlled in order to make our experiment a valid experiment. So the factors that affect the growth of the plant are the amount of water, the amount of the sunlight received, the amount of soil, the type of soil used, and the amount of air. So if Rami is testing the effect of changing the amount of fertilizers on the growth of the plant, he must keep all these factors constant one, or he should not change these factors at all. For this reason, we will name them controlled variables. So guys, let's practice more. In this example, Sarah would like to test the effect of temperature on the amount of salt dissolved in water. We will help Sarah to set the variables. So if we look at the given photo shown on the slide, it shows us the different test tubes that are used for this experiment. What does Sarah have to change from one tube to another? So you have to notice that Sarah is changing the temperature between the given test tubes. So the first test tube was set on 10 degrees Celsius, while the second one on 20 degrees Celsius. The third one was set on 30 degrees Celsius. The fourth one was set on 40 degrees Celsius. And the fifth one was set on 50 degrees Celsius. So Sarah was changing the temperature between the given test tubes. So what do we name the factor that is changed by the scientist or by the person who's doing the experiment? If you remember, we do call it the independent variable. So in this case, the independent variable is the temperature, since Sarah is changing the temperature. Accordingly, the temperature is the independent variable. So what is Sarah going to measure in each tube? Initially, Sarah was setting different tubes on different temperatures, and she was trying to measure the amount of salt dissolved in each tube. So Sarah was measuring the amount of salt dissolved. For this reason, we call the amount of salt dissolved as the dependent variable. Why? Because what we measure in a given experiment is called dependent variable. And in this case, Sarah was measuring the amount of salt dissolved in each given test tube set on different temperature. So briefly, the independent variable causes the effect on the dependent variable. Let's go back to Sarah's experiment. So Sarah was changing the temperature. So the temperature was the independent variable, and she was trying to measure the amount of salt according to the given temperature in a given test tube. So Sarah was increasing the temperature, and she was trying to find the effect of increasing temperature on the amount of salt dissolved. So for Sarah's experiment, we identified the independent variable, which was the temperature, and the dependent variable, which was the amount of salt dissolved. Now, what about the controlled variable? Or what about the element that is not changing throughout the given experiment? Keep in your mind that Sarah should use the same kind of salt in her experiment. Why? Because different salts dissolved in different amounts too, and this will affect negatively the results of her experiment. So she has to use the same kind of salt in all the given test tubes, and she has to use the salt of the same chemical formula from the same source. Also, if you look carefully at the given figure shown on the slide, you will notice that all the test tubes are containing the same volume of water. So, the second control variable is the same volume of water should be used too. Why? Because more water will dissolve more salt, and the results also will be non-reliable ones. Hence, Sarah in her experiment should also use the same volume of water in all the given test tubes, and she can measure the same volume of water by using a graduated cylinder. Until now, Sarah has two variables to be controlled. So she has to use the same kind of salts in all the given test tubes, and she has to add the same volume of water for all the given test tubes in the experiment. Now, Sarah has a third variable to be controlled too, which is the kind of water. So Sarah should use the same kind of water in all the given test tubes in the experiment. Why? Because different kinds of water will dissolve salt in different amounts according to the mineral composition. What is the best solution for this, or in this case, we have to use the distilled water H2O because it doesn't contain minerals. So let's sum it up. The independent variable, or what Sarah was changing in the experiment, was the temperature. And what Sarah was measuring or testing or observing in the experiment was the amount of the salt dissolved. The kind of the salt used, the volume of the water, and the kind of water used, they were all the same in all the given test tubes. So these are what do we call the controlled variables. Guys, in the previous session, we learned that the first stage in the scientific investigation is to write a good inquiry question. Now, because we learned also about variables, so a good inquiry question should include the variables too, but it should include only the dependent and the independent variables. You can't mention the controlled variable in a given inquiry question. Let's take Sarah's experiment as an example. The first inquiry question that you can ask is, how does the increase in the water temperature affect the amount of salt dissolved? Or, what is the relationship between increasing the temperature of water and the amount of salt dissolved? Well, we're done with our lesson for today. Just please try to solve this challenging question on your copybooks. And in case you were having any misconceptions or any questions, join directly the Zoom meeting. I will be there and we will practice more. See you, and thank you for attending this session.